So next up, we have our panel on critical reflections on anti-oppression and responsible allyship with Isa and Annika. Unfortunately, Dr. Siham Rayal is under the weather today, so she can't join us, but I'm sure this is going to be an amazing conversation. So I'm going to just start with a little bit of a background about both our panelists today. So Isa has been a lifelong advocate for children's rights. In 2013, she founded an international volunteer-based charity, Isa's Teddy Bear Foundation, to provide physical and emotional support to children in need. Isa serves as a Plan International Canada Youth Ambassador, a member of the United Nations Environment Programme's Children and Youth Major Group, Advisory Board at the SN Canada, and is currently completing a Master's in Public Policy at the Max Bell School of Public Policy. Isa is committed to helping young people realize their rights and freedoms through service-based learning, storytelling, and social impact activities. So virtual round of applause for Isa for joining us today. Next up, we have Annika. Annika works from an intersectional anti-oppressive operational framework. As a Muslim woman of color with multiple other intersectional identities, she brings her lived experience authentically into her work. She has experience in humanitarian coordination, feminist and anti-oppression research, grassroots mobilization, and international youth advocacy. Annika holds a Master of Arts in Social Justice and Equity Studies from Brock University, where she looked at a feminist and anti-colonial perspectives on social enterprise. Prior to her master's, she completed her honors Bachelor of Science in Neurobiology, specializing in learning, memory, and neurobiophysics. We give another round of applause for Annika for joining us today. So thank you both so much for being a part of this panel. You're doing such amazing work in the field of anti-oppression and responsible allyship and have vast expertise. With that being said, our first question is, how do you incorporate anti-oppression work within your work, or how do you use your platform? And we'll just popcorn style it. We're a very small panel, so whoever is ready to answer can kind of go for it.
Do you want me to start, Anika? Okay. All right. So, hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here. And I've loved meeting so many of you today. All of your projects seem awesome, and I can't wait to, see where this takes you all. So I think this is a really important question to start off with, just to kind of see where we're at with our work. So as Ganya mentioned, I run a children's charity, and I have for the past almost 9 years now. And starting out, I don't think I, put a label on the work I was doing at all. I had just a very fundamental understanding of some of these issues. But over time, I realized, the need to not just address anti-oppression work as part of what I was doing, but to actually be loud about it. And the reason is that we were doing something different in the way that our nonprofit works by repurposing and distributing pre-loved clothing, toys, books, and other supplies to children in need all around the world. So we work under the premise that we want kids to look within themselves and the items that they have at home to give in ways that don't necessarily require a financial contribution, but to individuals who had items to give, but also those who would be receiving these items. And so for me, anti-oppression work meant knowing where to take a step forward and when to take a step back. And by this, I mean that there are certain organizational circles that I am a part of, not only with my charity, but also with, the boards that I sit on. And there are certain stages that I'm asked to speak on that seek to highlight the voices of women in color, minority women, but there were also opportunities that came up that I wasn't the most well-versed to speak on. And in those moments, I think that it's important that I don't just take up space for the sake of taking up space, but that I take a step back so that I'm not occupying the stage when it's not right for me to do so, or speaking on experiences that are not exclusively my own. Learning when and how to do this took a lot of practice. And while I haven't perfected the art yet, it's a work in progress, and I think I'm learning. One tool in particular that never serves me wrong is self-reflection. Whenever I'm invited to speak on an event such as this one, I do some research, some introspection, and some intention setting too. And then I craft my responses accordingly to the organization. And, you know, if there is any way that I can uplift and empower young people, not just through my organization, but through the opportunities that I'm a part of, by, you know, bringing a young person who's comfortable with me to some events, then I try to do that.
Thanks, Isa. I think that's a great kind of start into this concept of like locating your privilege and using your privilege. Like all of you will have access to certain spaces by virtue of the fact that, you know, a variety of reasons. Maybe you present as a man, maybe you are a white person, maybe you have a university education or are in a university space. Those are privileges that you will have access to and of course, that's not a bad thing. I think recognizing that privilege is not a bad thing. It's how you use it. And Tarana Burke has a quote that to something of that effect, that inherently privilege is not a bad thing. It's how you use it to help people. So yeah, saying no, I think sometimes can just be really strong. And instead of just saying no, saying, I might not be the best suited, but here are people I know who are. And so I've been in that situation before where people have reached out to me and said, hey, can you speak on this panel? And I'll be like, I'm not a Black woman. And I think a Black woman would be a better fit to speak. Here are some of my colleagues or friends that I know that would be a good fit. The other way that I think about anti-oppression is really, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the concept of, it's concept used often in critical disability studies, but of the ramp. Basically that if you have stairs, it's not accessible to all people, especially those with mobility challenges. But if you have a ramp, people who are able-bodied and those who are not can all use it. So if you build systems, build initiatives, build projects with the communities that have the most barriers to entry in mind, it will serve everyone. It's not a, you know, race to, what did I call it? It's not a zero-sum game, right? Like everyone can benefit if you build systems, build initiatives, build projects with those who are who have the most obstacles to access in mind. And I think that's one thing that I really reflect on when we talk about anti-oppression or intersectionality. These are fun buzzwords that people like to use when they say, I use an intersectional approach. And I'm like, or we're hoping to envision an intersectional future. And I'm like, that's great. But I think we really need to keep in mind at the end of the day that the way these concepts were created, the way that Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw coined intersectionality was not as an end goal. It was always and will always be a tool to help us revision better systems. It is not enough to just simply be comfortable in the system we're already in. It's about using these tools, these frameworks to push back against the failures of the systems we're in, whatever system that is, and create a new one. These are not end goals, they're only tools.
No, both your responses are so insightful. And I think you both touched on very important aspects about positionality and kind of knowing your place within conversations. I think especially when you're diving into the advocacy space, it's very easy to like try and take on as many opportunities as possible. So I think that kind of leads into my next question of like, how does your identity or your positionality affect your work? Like, how do you kind of navigate that? Annika, specifically, you mentioned like that instance where you're like, I'm not a Black woman. I think a Black woman would be the best to speak on an issue like this. And you as well, Isa, you were saying something about like intentionalism, right? So a question to both of you, how do you kind of navigate that, especially in early stages of your career?
Great. I'll get started again. So as you know, like my organization's based in Canada, but we operate as well to meet the needs of children in low income families across the globe. Over the years, we've expanded this a little bit more. And I was just talking to a few people about how, you know, this was a really personal project for me starting out. And I didn't expect it to grow as quickly as it did, and especially not to the international level. So learning how to navigate that, I think, was really important, just because I was working with people, different cultural backgrounds and upbringings and values, most importantly, because I would never want to go into a community and impose like my views or my worldviews when it doesn't align or doesn't make sense with what they believe in, especially. So something that I work to do is, we support organizations in countries around the globe that are constrained in their resource, like financial or other capacities. In the Philippines, we've supported an existing children's charity. A little shout out to the Tagum City Children's Relief Fund. They work to restore the health of malnourished children. And the founder, my friend David, loved our work of repurposing and distributing clothing, toys, and books. And he wanted to bring this to the community. And so we worked together, and under his purview and with his incredible team, we were able to provide good items to families and teddies to children who were graduating out of their nutrition programs. And so my intentions, I like that you use that word, are always to, prevent and mitigate harm. If I find that I'm, taking something that works in our in the Canadian context and trying to apply that to an organization overseas, it almost like never works that way, right? And so it's important to let relationships build more naturally. So I've kind of used my relationship with David and his organization as a framework for when working with other organizations, and I was really, grateful that that happened so early on in my nonprofit journey, because it set like the precedent for me and how I would like build these relationships moving forward with other organizations. And for schools, especially like overseas, we've had schools like reach out to us with their needs. And it just makes a really, a more respectful back and forth. And I try to hold myself to that standard, and the volunteers that work for us as well.
That's a great question. I don't know where to start. Okay, how does your privilege or positionality affect your work? So for those of you that may not be familiar, the concept of positionality refers to where your identities situate you within the existing systems and multitude of systems. When I exist in spaces, I recognize that regardless of whether or not I am aware of it, I have certain identities that impact the way that people see me. And so what I have really started to do in recent years, and it's still a journey, I'm still on my own journey, is instead of allowing other people to create their own assumptions of what my identity is, being a woman of color, being a visible Muslim woman, being, not able-bodied, all of these things, what does that mean? And everyone has their own opinion. So instead of allowing other people's opinions to drive the way that they perceive me, I've decided to take ownership of that. And I've decided to be very vulnerable. A lot of the spaces, and Ganya, you read my bio saying, Anika is a Muslim woman of color and all of these things. And so I name it. And I recognize that that is a privilege, because I feel safe enough to be able to name it, but also B, I am someone who is willing to be vulnerable in those spaces and explicitly say that, because I'm recognizing that people might push back against it. And I am willing to put in the emotional labor to hold those conversations. Not everyone has that. And I'm not saying that everyone here should go into these spaces and say, every single identity you hold, make yourself completely vulnerable, exploit your trauma for all those spaces, because quite frankly, not everyone deserves it, but it also is very emotionally demanding. It requires a lot of you personally. But that being said, this is how I've kind of navigated my own positioning. And sometimes I name it. I just name what perspective I'm coming from, because not only does it allow me to say, okay, I recognize what you're saying about X, Y, and Z, but based on my experience, which may be different from yours, and I'll name that experience, that doesn't ring true to me. And it allows me to, and I am in spaces that are disproportionately white, male, cis, so very, very privileged folks. It allows me to say, just because your experience, your anecdotal experience, and that of all the people who look like you, who are your peers, is one way, doesn't mean that it is the same for everyone. And even if you don't believe that, you cannot discount my experience just because it hasn't been your own. On the other hand, it also gives other people the ability to name it if they have issues or challenges. So instead of putting other people in the position of assuming, well, Anika's speaking from a privileged point of view, or, how do I broach these subjects? It allows me to openly say, look, I'm a Muslim woman of color, so all of my perspectives are coming from this experience. If there's a Black woman in that space who says, actually, Anika, I think you are still speaking from a position of privilege, me explicitly saying that allows them to say, okay, Anika, you have said you're operating from this perspective. That's why this might not be true for Black folk, right? So I think how it affects my work is it's something I'm never able to completely divorce myself from. And I think that is where we talk about privilege, right? Like if you can put aside an identity, that's huge privilege. And I don't have that privilege. But I also recognize that just because I may not have privilege in certain spaces does not mean that there are people who have very different, quote unquote, underprivileged or further disenfranchised identities. And so by naming it and allowing that to influence the way I do my work, but also very explicitly saying, look, this is the perspective I speak from, and that gives me incredible insight in a way that people who have not lived it may not. It also allows other people to say, okay, but you may not go far enough. And that's not a fault of you. That's part of it, right? It's opening those spaces. I don't know if I've exactly answered your question, or I've taken it on a completely different.
No, that was great. No, that was great. And I think both of you touched on very important notions of privilege. I think like when everyone was kind of having that global awakening of kind of being more in tune with what was happening around the world, the word privilege just turned into a really, really negative word. But it's like you have privilege whether you choose to or not. It's kind of what you decide to do with it. And I think my next question kind of leads into, how do people use their privilege and do not fall into that notion of performative allyship? How do you ensure that, in recognizing your privilege, you're having that genuine allyship?
Yeah, really important question. So part of my work is with children's charities, but also as you know, I do some work with boards and committees to ensure that the spaces that they're creating and that they operate in are youth friendly. So this is often easier said than done. And I've witnessed organizations both like create these elaborate plans for youth engagement, but then they fail to actually fully realize them. Or in other cases, the plans have been implemented, but then there's a chronic lack of follow-up. Especially when working with children, I think like organizations and individuals need to be especially cognizant of how they're, interacting with young people. I think that there's a need for them to be careful how they request information, how they converse with young people, and how they like wrap up the relationship. And what I mean by this last point is that if youth are asked to recount difficult experiences, including those that may be like traumatizing for them to rehash, I think it's so important for resources and follow-up to be put in place to offer ongoing support. And all of this is part of genuine allyship. And in my mind, it's not just the short dialogue that we share with an individual, which is often one-sided. Genuine allyship should go beyond this to establish like lasting connections with individuals who made the work in question possible in the first place. And I also think that like if participants in a certain like study or something are feeling burnt out by engaging in activism and organizing spaces, those engaging them are likely not doing a good enough job to ensure that adequate resources and support are available to them. So like I said, working with kids, this becomes like incredibly important because they're at like such a like critical and formative part of their life, and the relationships that they build in these stages are going to like create like lasting impacts on them. So we have to be really cognizant of that. So part of my advocacy work includes like improving the ways that organizations are leading these relationships, but also helping those young people enter organizing spaces with a better mindset of, you know, how to advocate on their own behalf to make sure that things like this don't happen.
That's a great point. For me, the difference between performative and genuine allyship is good allyship, genuine allyship is shown, it's not told. And maybe there's a level of of me being on a panel and saying, I try to be an ally when I'm like, real allyship isn't just saying you're an ally, right? It means actually taking yourself out of spaces sometimes that no matter, maybe you really, really want to be in, but you know, you're not the best fit, right? And I think Isa also touches on like genuine relationships. Allyship is not about, and I think the way it's been co-opted is like, oh, I'm a white person, I'm an ally, I have Black friends. It's like, that's not what allyship is, right? Allyship is willing to, even if it sounds like a great opportunity or it's a great access for you, being willing to step out of those spaces, because there's someone else who will benefit from it more. It's not about saying, I'm not going to benefit, therefore I'm going to pass it off. It's about saying, yes, I might benefit, but there are so many other people who might benefit more. Maybe they will benefit from being compensated and getting an honorarium. Maybe they'll benefit from it because it means a new contract for work. Maybe they'll benefit from it because it just means new connections and they're looking for work, right? I think that's a big piece. But also, like Isa said, making genuine connections. Performative allyship is just, we talk about volunteerism, right? Like traveling to a different country and taking photos with little Black kids without clothes on, as like they're a prop, like they're an object, but there's no real genuine long-term relationship there, right? Whereas genuine allyship means that if you're working with a community, you deeply, deeply understand that community. Either you live within that community, or your friends are there, or you know these people by name. It's not just another photo. It's not just another person, you know, on a docket of images. That's not what allyship is. Allyship is using your privilege to create genuine connections and amplify those who may not have as many opportunities as you do.
No, both of you touch on really, really amazing points. And I think the concept of volunteerism is very important, especially international tourism. So both of your work, both of you have had, you know, experience in the international space, international sphere. How would you say like anti-oppression has been incorporated into your work internationally?
I'm rolling my eyes because I don't think it has. I've been working in the international cooperation sector for a few years now, and I'm actually moving into a government role that's in this space. And unfortunately, for those of you who are interested in working in international policy, I'm very sorry to inform you that I think the sector is actually quite behind. I think the sector is not on par with the other conversations we're having in the public consciousness around anti-oppression. And I still think that the general public conversations don't go far enough. I think it's a multitude of reasons, right? The international development sector or international cooperation sector was built as a legacy of colonial Christian missionary work, and that's permeated a lot of the spaces, or permeated a lot of the work that currently is being done. The majority of those who have access to the highest positions are typically white, cis, Christian men, partly because these are very powerful positions. Think about ambassadors, think about big diplomats. All of this to say that I think we're starting to have these conversations. We're talking about diversifying our approach. We're talking about not taking up space in different countries. We're talking about hiring and learning from local communities. I've been seeing, and maybe this is just with cautious optimism, more diversification in the number of diplomats that are being hired by the Canadian government. So I think there's conversations that are happening, but I do want to caution all of you that this space is very much behind. Like, I think we're still unpacking why we need to, take Canadian funder money and give it back to local communities, right? Well, we have experts here on gender and equity. Shouldn't we hire them instead because they're Canadians? You think about the reporting processes for nonprofits. They're these huge, inaccessible pieces that take hours and hours and hours that a small organization may not have, right? You think about the way that, I think one good example is the way that the taxes are being, contested recently. And I'm sure many of you have heard of the Canadian Muslim NGOs that all of a sudden were told that they had to suspend their nonprofit or their tax deduction status because of a, what do they call, a financial audit of financial documents from 10, 15 years ago. So I think like the sector itself is very behind. And I think because of that, there is starting to be a need. It means that a lot of young people who are coming from diverse backgrounds have to do a lot of emotional labor, often unpaid, often demanded of them, because people see them as kind of like a free pass. Oh, they can do programs and they can teach everybody about anti-racism, right? So I think it's tough because as much as you want to demand fair compensation, demand the extra work that you deserve, the extra money that you deserve for the extra work you're doing, it's also that balance of, but if I don't do it, who will? Right. And I think it's trying to strike that balance because you shouldn't be feeding into the nonprofit industrial complex, as one of my friends says, of this, like, I need to kill myself and work myself into the ground to prove I care about this work. You deserve compensation, but also recognizing that to a certain extent, there is a limitation, especially within nonprofit spaces, especially within NGOs where budgets are very restricted. And so, yes, always demand compensation, but also recognize that it is in the private sector, right? You're not going to be making six figures doing this type of work, even though I think it is worth that much, if not more. Once again, me going on a tangent, so I'll hand it off to Isa.
Alrighty. So virtually all of my experience is working with kids. And while on the surface, people might think that there's no anti-oppression work that exists here, I argue that like some of the most important work does happen at this early level, especially, like I said, so critical to young people's development. But yeah, I wish I had come across like this concept of anti-oppression even earlier on in my work. But one thing that's helped me, I feel like, catch up is like following diverse voices on social media, reading articles by, people that your views might contradict with. You don't necessarily need to, put yourself in a bubble where you're only surrounding yourself with people that you agree with, whose views don't contradict your own. For me, doing this challenges me to see the world through a different perspective. Doesn't necessarily mean that I'll change my perspective, but in advocacy, even if everyone's working towards a common goal or for a common cause, like, it's very rare that everyone will share the same political, societal, or other views. And whether or not we realize it, what we read online really shapes the world that we live in. So this simple practice helps me keep an open mind, and I feel like is preparing me for a life of like continued learning about cultures that are different from my own, and meeting new people and building these lasting relationships too. And I think that's especially important when you're, as you mentioned, like traveling, navigating these new cultures, traveling internationally, just like not imposing your world views on other people, even if you don't necessarily agree with them, and coming from a place of just empathy and understanding.
No, I think you guys definitely touched on like some really, really important things. And I think as we're, we all want to like, help out other people, and we always feel like we have to like go abroad to do that. So I think like definitely recognizing it starts from within, it starts from you, making sure you have your intention set, and kind of slipping back into conversations of allyship, the word allyship is actually very controversial in many activist and organizing spaces due to its relation with performative activism, which we've talked about. Do you find that allyship is still relevant today, or is it losing its power? And I'd also love to see or hear your perspectives on how you think the limitations of allyship can be seen in our current SDG 2030 framework. How is like the way that we're not approaching our goals, how does that kind of link to these notions of performative activism and the controversial tension with the word allyship itself? So that was a loaded question. I will type it out as well, but whoever wants to start that.
I see Isa shaking her head going, no, please. Loaded question. Let's try to do this in bits and pieces. And I have many things to say, so I won't be able to get through to all of it. But I'll try to share very, very Sparks Note. Do kids use Sparks Note anymore? As much as I can. I personally dislike the word allyship. I think it's become a buzzword that has been used to pass off responsibility. I think people use it the same way that you see like anti-racist rhetoric of like, I can't be racist, I have a Black friend, or I'm married to a Black woman, or whatever it is. I think people say, I'm an ally, I can't be doing bad things, I care about these communities. It's like, you can care about these communities very genuinely and still be doing harm. So I think I personally don't like the word allyship, not because of the meaning of the word allyship, but because of the way that I think it's being used currently to pass off responsibility and say, no, I don't need to critically evaluate what I'm doing because I'm an ally. I'm an ally. It means I'm doing good things, right? Do I think it's still relevant? I think the action of allyship is, but I think it's very hard because we've touched on locating your privilege, right? For me, when I think of what effective allyship is, it means using your privilege. It means stepping out of spaces. It means, willing to lose your job because you're calling out really, really tough, deep-seated things in your organization, right? Like, it means being willing to say, I'm not the best fit for this panel, even though the honorarium might be $500. Here's 5 other people that have different experiences. No, I won't take this job opportunity, or I won't take this really cool volunteer opportunity because actually this will be a much more impactful career trajectory opportunity for someone else, right? That's what I think is effective allyship. The way the word allyship is used now, I don't think is what actually is happening. I think a lot of people use it to say, yeah, I care about it. But if, like I said, allyship manifests in actions, not words, right? So if people aren't doing both, then it doesn't matter how many times you tell me that you're an ally. If the actual work you're doing is only reinforcing the communities, the marginalizations, reinforcing your privilege and power. Do I think it's still relevant? Yes, in the way if it's actioned correctly and not in the way it's discussed. I think one of the biggest pieces when I think about the 2030 framework is the fact that it's international, and that means a lot of really willing to be humble, especially from, those of us that come from privilege, like those of us in Canada, really willing to step back and say, I'm not the person who you should be listening to. Let me actually hand my platform to somebody who's, from a small island developing nation who can actually speak about climate change more effectively than I can, right? Or talk about life below water more effectively than me living in Toronto with very little water access apart from Lake Ontario, right? So once again, I think it's a very, very big question. I think we could have a whole panel based on just this one question alone, but I'll leave it here for now and hand it over to Isa.
Yeah, awesome. So I would argue that it's not really losing power, but the fact that people think it is very telling of the fact that we're not engaging in meaningful allyship as well as we should be. My understanding of how allyship has become performative or subject to criticism is because of the space that allies are occupying, especially in contrast to the amount of space taken up by those experiencing some of these issues. So Yeah, I think it goes back to that issue of positionality and space. I would add as well, around your point on the SDGs framework, I think the war in Ukraine is a very telling example of when people choose to be allies. And this goes back to, I believe it's like goal 16, right? Peace, justice, and strong institutions. So whose bodies are worth protecting, right? And calling ourselves like allies, especially in the space, when there are wars occurring across the globe. I'm a part of some organizations that have been so quiet about wars in other parts of the world and have put all their resources into advocating for, the war in Ukraine and against the war, but for Ukrainians fleeing war, and even seeing Canada open its doors to refugees after saying that we had reached our cap of immigrants. So it's just really interesting, the stark contrast and the blatant disregard for human life when it's certain bodies that are deemed as less worthy of protecting. So yeah, that's part of my qualms with the framework, but even the fact that it's, the agenda is set for 2030, world leaders have, been very transparent about the fact that some of these goals are just not going to be met by this time frame. The fact that we're working towards them still is great, and we should continue doing that. But it is again very telling of who was at the table when some of these decisions were being made. Was there enough representation of individuals from the global south, right? Because I think it would be very clear. I was an international delegate to UNEA 5, and some of the youth delegates from Kenya were sharing how if they were asked about this time frame and whether no hunger, no poverty is feasible by 2030, it would be very clear that it's not, because of the extent of these issues. And so, yeah, I think it's a bit of a disregard and just choosing to glaze over certain issues, not because of a lack of awareness, but a lack of empathy and caring for certain people and bodies.
No, I love that you brought up the discrepancy in international response, especially in relation to Ukraine. And I think let's flesh it out a little bit. I think, as advocates, we're we have to speak up for everyone, but then there are these huge repercussions actually when you're speaking up about certain wars, repercussions that can lose to, as we've seen, people mass unemployment, people losing their jobs and because of their relation to things like this, right? So how do you navigate it as a young person where there are these very real consequences to trying to speak up about this major injustice, this major discrepancy?
Sorry, not to take up too much space, but maybe I'll just complete this thought a little bit. It's so real, that issue, being early on in your career, applying for jobs and worrying about whether your tweet about, freeing Palestine will reflect poorly on you. For me, at the end of the day, it came down to the fact that if I'm working for an organization that does not support, whose morals and values don't align more closely with my own, it's not an organization worth working for. And yeah, it's such a real issue, and I think it's very troubling for young people, especially because of how much we express these thoughts online, and everything that we post exists online forever. But the fact that I know you don't need to post things online to show that you care about them, but realizing how much of an impact social media can actually have in raising awareness for these issues, and how much it's done and can continue to do if we use our resources effectively. Maybe I'll just share a personal example. I've always wanted to work for UNICEF just because of children's rights charity, very close to my heart, the personal connection. I was worried about that. I'm really vocal on social media, and I don't shy away from posting about like issues that I care about. And it was something that crossed my mind and something that others had brought up to me as well. One example is sharing about the book on how to be an anti-racist. There's a kids version that was coming out, and I posted about it. And that's like stirred some controversy among some people in my circle who I thought I was close with, because of apparent, like, you know, anti-racism is not a real thing. This is all made up. And it's just knowing how to speak your truth, knowing how to defend the things you care about became really important to me. Not shying away from it just because other people don't agree with your perspective doesn't mean that you have to impose all of your worldviews on other people, but it should mean that you're confident enough in what you stand for that you're not going to shy away from the things that you care about just because other people disagree with you. And in terms of like applying for jobs, it didn't negatively impact me at all. Like the fact that I was vocal on social media, in fact, it did the opposite, because I put a lot of thought and care into what I share online, and I'm able to defend it, right? It doesn't come from a place of cruelty or wanting to cause harm, but the complete opposite. So this is not to say don't be mindful on what you post online, but it's just like a matter of being able to defend what you stand for and being confident in that.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing. I don't have a fully formed thought response to this. I think one thing I do want to recognize is that the fear of saying certain things because of the way that it might impact your safety, your future career, is valid. And that's perfectly fine. I think being in a position where you don't have to think about it is privilege, right? Sorry. Work from home. It is a privilege, right? And unfortunately, young people who are young people, full stop, but also folks who are looking for work, who may not have, long, huge legacies of families who are well connected, they don't have the privilege of being very outspoken about things that can be often controversial, and that's perfectly valid. I think at the end of the day, it's about respecting your own safety, respecting your own career, and just because you're not vocal and running outside and shouting from the rooftops that you think that we should free Palestine doesn't mean you care about it any less, right? I think it's about navigating the spaces that you're in the safest way for you. It's not to say that like be ignorant about everything and don't care that, and I know all of you are not taking that with that spirit, but it does mean like, yes, unfortunately we live in a system where where people who are looking for work, where even people with work have to be unfortunately very diplomatic in the way that they approach these conversations. And then the last thing, I know I mentioned the nonprofit industrial complex. It is not worth your mental health or your physical mental safety to kill yourself to prove that you care about a cause. So all of that to say that, like, yes, it is a privilege to be in those spaces, but also like no one will think less of you just because you're not putting yourself in a situation of mental harm. And that's not the only way to prove that you care about these spaces, right? We have people who, and I think we see this with the systems that work negatively against us, right? People can say nothing on social media and open their pocketbooks and donate millions and millions of dollars to causes that, probably they shouldn't even have access to donate to, right? So just retweeting, sharing, speaking out about it is not the only way that you can do good work. So keep yourself safe and trust that your intuition will let you know what the best approach is.
No, thank you. I think like that's something that I know I'm still personally navigating too as well. And I'm sure many, advocates are kind of thinking of that real life, like implications of the things that we say on social media. And, it's very, not easy, but like, it's hard to like figure out, I don't want to make it seem like I don't care about this, especially, Palestine is a very real example, because as we know, like there's current issues happening right now, like today, yesterday, and it's hard to, you know, kind of be mindful, like if I post this, am I not going to get this opportunity? Am I not going to get this job? So thank you both for highlighting like how you both personally navigate that, and like with very real advice, because I think it's something we all need to kind of, you know, take with a grain of salt, making sure that we're checking within ourselves before we kind of go forward with these things. So thank you so much. And another question that I think is like a really, really big one is how have you ever come across the savior complex in your work? I'd love you both to kind of both define it as to what it means to you, because I think it'd be interesting to hear both your perspectives on that. And how do you approach, you know, preventing yourself from having a savior complex, but also when you're seeing people around you kind of have that mentality, how do you navigate that?
All right, I'll get started. Maybe I'll just give like a little example before getting started, but unfortunately on several occasions I've like witnessed this issue, mainly through, you know, taking part in volunteer trips and things like that. So I've actually never accepted the offer to take a volunteer trip with an organization because I had a gut feeling that something felt off about them. And this was since high school, you know, they would have like trips abroad. Volunteering and service work was central to my life for like years before being introduced to volunteer trips. But I just didn't like the way in which that they were being advertised and offered to students. It just didn't sit right. Like, you know, seeing children on posters and knowing that you would be going and helping them was amazing. But running a children's charity myself, like we've been really conscious of never exploiting like children and pictures of children and things like that. And I felt like some of these organizations did it with like, they did it so openly and like didn't shy away from like it at all. So I wanted to do, like, if I ever took a volunteer trip, I knew like in that moment, like I would do it differently. So over time, just learning about the harms of things like volunteerism, I'm glad that I didn't jump at the opportunity just because it seemed fun or interesting. And it's not to shame anyone who's ever been on one of these trips, because it is such a learning experience and opportunity for people. And I think like you can only learn from them. So I wanted to ensure that like if I ever took a trip, I would set my intentions before traveling. So my family took a trip to like my parents' home country, Pakistan, and we had the opportunity to visit local schools and learn from teachers and students. And I had like a thought. I started wondering like, why can't we enter countries and new spaces with the intention to learn rather than imposing our own ideas and needs on them? And so I started like in this trip taking a step back and just listening to the experience of individuals at these schools. And then later we were on vacation in Thailand, and I wanted to transform it into something more than that. I thought we have some extra time, like we could do touristy things, or we could lend ourselves to an organization in need. We did some searching online and really quickly found an organization that shared with us that they were really short staffed that day. And so they needed like some extra volunteers to help them. So we did some like quick training, and we were just able to lend an extra hand to like prepare food for children who were living at this orphanage. So long answer to your question, like, yes, I have come across the savior complex. There are ways to avoid it. And for me, that's been talking less and listening more. Maybe I'll pass it over to Anika, and then I'll tackle the second part of that question.
Yeah, I think working in the international cooperation space, absolutely. Savior complex, what it means to me is basically this concept that communities, especially those internationally that are facing challenges, poverty, drought, humanitarian crises, war, are experiencing this because of some inherent fault within these communities themselves, a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding of democracy, or however it's phrased, as if these communities, these crises are justified in these communities by virtue of their identity, right? And I think we've heard it with Prince William going, oh, war in Ukraine, we don't expect it as like it's normal in other countries, right? And it's this concept that, oh, these communities, because of their identity, somehow are deserving of these crises. And so the savior complex positions people with privilege, so typically white folk, typically Christian folk, typically those from the West, as able to go and save these communities from themselves, right? So the reason that Maasai warriors in Kenya are experiencing, challenges is not because of the fact that colonialism has really removed them from their own historic indigenous knowledge. It's because they aren't educated and have degrees, and therefore young college students can go and help address decades, centuries long oppression. So that's how what the savior complex is. Have I come across it? Absolutely. I work in the international development sector. It's a dime a dozen here. I guess like the one way that I've really tried myself, and like I said, it's still a journey, I'm still on my own journey, is recognizing that actually I don't know anything, and really being willing to be humble in these spaces, and listen to these communities. These communities are experts on their own situation, the very same way that when I say listen to youth, they are the experts on the exact challenges that they are facing. If any of you position yourselves at, hey, I'm the expert on, what it's like being a student at McGill, for example, if you're a McGill student, right? That's the same situation of who's a better person to speak about the reality of being a young Sudanese refugee living in a camp in Uganda than a young Sudanese refugee living in a camp in Uganda, right? And so I think a lot of the ways to deliberately disrupt that is really checking people, saying, hey, are we actually talking to these communities that we're saying we're serving, or are we only imposing what we think is the best solution? Who is involved in the design of these policies and practices? If you're running a program internationally with community groups in South Asia, are you actually talking to these community groups and asking them, what do you need? What do you want? Do you actually need a program on how to disrupt systems of education for so that more women can go, or do you actually need funds so that you can pay for your young girls to go? What is the actual need? And I think that's a big piece, is like the savior complex comes from this position of we know better, and so we are saving these communities, whereas good work comes from a recognition that I don't know anything. These communities know what they need. All they need is the access to the resources that I may have because of whatever space I'm coming from. And it is my responsibility to bridge the communities that know their needs to the resources that they can that can help them achieve those needs. I am only a middleman. I am only a bridge. I am not the expert in this space. And I think that's the biggest advice I could give.
Thank you so much. Isa, did you have another point to add?
I mean, I think Anika summarized it perfectly, so.
Okay, amazing. We have about 2 more questions. So just one question in the chat is the social media point before is something very relatable. How have you found navigating engaging in advocacy work through social media as youth when engaging with older folks within the space / older generation who may not see the value of social media?
Sorry, I'm just reading the question. I mean, I think advocacy takes on so many forms, and that's really beneficial, especially in this case, right? Like the ways that we advocate online, if that doesn't translate to, individuals who are less comfortable using social media, but are still interested in some of these issues, like advocacy doesn't exist in one space alone. And so it's usually really easy to translate some of this knowledge. And that comes from experience, like working with kids and helping young people become advocates in their own life. Like also young people, like older people, not super tech savvy. Actually, I take that back. Kids are pretty tech savvy, but they're not on social media for the most part. And so, yeah, working with young people, takes on other forms. So some examples are using children's books to outline like the Conventions on the Rights of the Child, for example, making some of this information really tangible and practical for them, and doing crafts and other activities that they can use. So for older people, it might look like, articles and so in like newspapers, or even like speaking events and things like that, to get the message across. So that's kind of my thought around that. Good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't really have a personal experience to speak to this because I haven't really experienced a challenge in this way. I think it's actually in the kindest way possible. I don't think it's correct to assume that older generations don't use social media. I think actually we can see with the rise of right-wing nationalism that older generations do use social media. The only difference is, unlike I think with younger generations, older generations haven't deciphered yet the best ways to demystify disinformation. And I think that's the challenge, right? Is like, for me, I haven't really found the I haven't found the challenge in convincing older communities, older generations that social media is valuable. The challenge I found is convincing them that not everything they read on the internet is the truth. And how do you actually find the right resources that are actually correct, right? Like how do you, and I think that's a larger conversation around like the perceived value of news outlets. That's a larger conversation around critical analysis, critical reading. And so I don't think it's so much a social media issue. But I also think, like Isa said, like advocacy doesn't happen in one space, and that's perfectly fine. Also, you don't always need to disclose, right? Like if you are learning through social media and you've been following on racism, or you've been following all these really cool research, of course, cite your sources, but that's not to say that you need to go into every single presentation and say, okay, so what I saw on Instagram this week was, right? I think it's about doing your due diligence and recognizing that it's perfectly valid to find your resources on social media, but make sure that that one TikTok that you saw is not the only one. Like I have a friend who I was telling her a fact I read on TikTok. She's like, okay, but cite your sources. Like, where's the, like, is that just something that people have been sharing, or is it actually actually found like true? Is that actually correct? And so I think it's actually a bigger conversation around like thinking critically around citing your sources, about doing your due diligence to make sure you're not spreading misinformation, and less a conversation about like the perceived value of social media, if that makes sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you both. And I think a lot of us, social media is like a way that we're getting our information, a way that we are doing our advocacy. So I think it's definitely not a mechanism to be discredited. But the importance of citing your sources is definitely something. There's a lot of people, old and young, who are still believing everything that they're seeing on social media. So we definitely need that. And then just our last question to wrap up our panel is, what do you think people can learn or do to incorporate anti-oppression just in their everyday life, like beyond work? How can you kind of, I don't want to say it in a catchy, like a snappy way, but like lead like that anti-oppression life? How are you making sure that it's integrated into your, like your values and stuff like that? So well, I'll have that to both of you to wrap us up.
Yeah, I think very short, learn, be open to learning, be open to feedback, for the most part. Of course, keep yourself safe, but recognize that when you receive constructive feedback, it's coming of a place of wanting you to reach your potential, and not coming of a place of attacking. Like if you get called out on your privilege, if you get called out on the ways that you say you communicate things. The very first time I ever ran an anti-oppression workshop, I had somebody call me out for the way that I used ableist language by accident in the very presentation where it was talking about anti-ableism, right? Like it's embarrassing sometimes, but I think it's like, if you take it as an opportunity to grow and not an attack, I think that's a big piece. So like really just staying open, being humble, and be willing to recognize that it's a means, not an end. So you're never going to become like absolute the anti-oppressive person, right? Like it will be a continuing journey, and it means being open to learn and being willing to put in the hard work to learn. Like we've talked about social media, there's tons of books, there's tons of workbooks that are like really, really great, and you can just do a quick Google search for them. But they require the willingness and the openness to learn and the humility to recognize that I might be wrong, and if I am wrong about things, it might actually mean very fundamentally changing a lot of things that have been very deep set, and that might actually require a very critical internal reflection. I'll leave it there.
That's a great point. I feel like it's this whole practice and trying to incorporate in my life, because it's always a work in progress, has made me a little bit more conscious of like issues as they arise in like spaces that I'm a part of, but also just like the you know, conferences and other events that take place and that I see on social media. It's important to make noise, but many organizations and individuals are making a lot of noise about decolonization. But the question becomes, is there like rhetoric matched by true action and reform? I think anti-oppression means like walking the line internally as well to drive change before you start preaching externally, and it means acting within your own circles to try to influence like or your own circles of influence to see like, you know, where can I drive change? Because it's often hardest to like hold yourself accountable and to recognize your own wrongs and to like concede some of your own tightly held power and to give that up. And so the hardest work is often internally, and speaking from experience, like trying to separate like my work from my identity as well, right? Seeing that like, you know, there are different circles that you're a part of, and you have to be willing to give up power if you're not the most well-versed to speak on some issues. In the context, actually, I'm thinking about like the recent International AIDS conference that took place in Montreal. I was reminded of how much work there is to do. Like there was the one panel on stigma related to HIV in clinical settings, and all panelists were denied like their visas to enter the country. So it was just an empty panel. And it's just like such a stark image of the discrimination against these populations like continuously, right? Like Canada's leading this conference to make change and is preaching about it. They're being loud, they're making noise, and yet like they're not supporting their own, like these panelists that they've invited to actually speak on these issues. So it's just, yeah, it's very, very obvious like contradictions and discrimination. And so I think it's important to see like who's really walking the walk, and to see like where is leadership like being compromised, or like who's consulted in these spaces, who's actually making the decisions, like going further and seeing like who's controlling the money and the flow of information that actually led to these conferences. So trying to do some digging and researching to understand that. I think doing so won't only move the needle on anti-racism and decolonization work, but also in this case in global health specifically, but to also move the power and decision-making from the hands of like a curated few to the hands of those who are most needed in those spaces.
Thank you guys so much. I think that's such an amazing like way to end off. I think definitely, you know, everyone should reflect on the practices that they're doing, and then also the important piece you guys both mentioned about doing your research, really kind of tracking where the money is coming from, as Isa said, really looking at the bigger picture is something we all need to do. A huge special thank you to Annika and Isa.